your chance to put your questions to our experts on a range of current topics. It's called Ask ITV News, and tonight our political correspondent Daniel Hewitt will focus on housing. And Daniel, your long-running investigation, which started in March last year, has uncovered pretty shocking and just terrible conditions that tenants are forced to live in, and they often don't know what their rights are.
That's absolutely right. We've had thousands of people contact us over the last 16 or 17 months or so on a number of issues, conditions being one of them, but also not just social housing tenants, private renters as well, people, leaseholders, people living in blocks with cladding on. There are a lot of issues, and it feels right now that the rights of tenants are once again, for the first time in a long time, at the front and centre of people's minds in this sector. Yeah,
as you say, then no surprises then that we've been contacted by lots of people with questions on a range of issues. Let's get the first one now, which comes from Rob in New Forest.
As a tenant and carer for someone with disabilities, I was pleased to hear the government promise to implement all of the Grenfell inquiry recommendations. What's the current status of the promise to introduce a legal requirement for personal emergency evacuation plans for people with mobility issues?
It's a really important question, this, from Rob. It's worth remembering that of the 37 disabled tenants that lived in the Grenfell Tower, 40% died in the fire. A shocking statistic. There simply weren't evacuation plans for them. There's a standoff right now. That's what Rob's question is getting at. The independent inquiry has recommended something called a personal emergency evacuation plan put in place for disabled tenants. The government has rejected it, saying it's too expensive and not logistically viable. They've offered an alternative. They're consulting on it, but there's a lot of anger about this, and it's one worth watching.
OK, another question now, and this question comes from Truss in Newham in East London.
What protection is there for housing association tenants and residents in relation to their service charges, as it doesn't seem to be covered in the existing government rent protections?
A lot of people over the last year or so have had their service charge increased, some by as much as 60%. Now, I've spoken to some tenants who've stopped paying their service charge. Some have even stopped paying their rent because they can't get repairs done. What I would say about this is you can appeal to an independent tribunal if you think your service charge is unreasonably high, and that tribunal will then look at it from both angles. What I would say it is a risk for tenants to withdraw their service charge to hold it back, because if you are found that it is reasonable by the tribunal, you are then in arrears and you've got yourself into debt effectively.
All right, and we've got more questions. This next one now comes from Deepa in Leicester.
With the extreme heat conditions we're seeing and prolonged summers, are our landlords obliged to retrofit our apartments with air conditioning? And going forwards, will this be included as a standard requirement in new build homes and apartments?
If only. The answer is no. The short answer is no. Landlords are absolutely not obliged to put air conditioning in your properties, though the last few weeks you probably would have benefited from it. The government has committed to achieving net zero by 2050. A big part of that net zero commitment will be looking at buildings, particularly social housing, old council blocks, which are really bad for emissions. One estimate, though, puts the cost of getting these buildings up to scratch in terms of kind of more climate friendly at £100 billion. And the government right now does not have an effective plan to make that happen. So the fact is, landlords watching this would say, well, I'm not going to put air conditioning into my apartment if the government hasn't got a plan itself. So no is the short answer.
OK. All right, well, another question now. And this one comes from James from South London.
In July this year, UK Finance put out a statement with the backing of most of the banks and building societies that they were going to start lending again on flats with building safety issues. But they actually don't seem to have started doing that yet, and most of them don't even seem to know about the statement that they've supposedly signed up to. Can you help with what's going on with that, please?
This could, in fact, be we could be here all night answering this one. For leaseholders, it's been a really tough time because they've effectively been stuck in their buildings because of cladding. There's been a big standoff over who should pay for it. There was a breakthrough recently when 6 banks said they would now lend mortgages on buildings with cladding on, because what's happened in the last couple of weeks is the government has effectively made builders and developers say, you've got to pay to get this cladding off. Now, in principle, those builders and developers have said, yes, we will start to pay to have that removed. The key date, though, here is August the 10th. That's the deadline the government have given building developers to put into writing to say, yes, we will remove it. I think once that happens, you might start to see banks start lending mortgages again.
August the 10th. All right,
August 10th.
couple more questions that we've had sent in. Molly in Oxfordshire asks, I'm a private renter and have mould in my flat. Is this the landlord's responsibility? What are my rights?
Yeah, it's a great question. As we know on this programme, we have seen some of the most shocking cases of mould and damp over the last year or so. It's hard to answer specifics. What I would say is if you have contacted your landlord and they're effectively ignoring you, what you can do is you can go to your local authority, go to your local council, and effectively they should, in theory, then inspect the property. And if they believe the landlord should do something about it, then they can force the landlord. The big caveat here, to put it bluntly, some councils are really good at that. Some councils are really quite useless. And that's partly not their fault because they've had their funding cut. They haven't got the inspection teams anymore. Another option for you is to take legal action. That, though, also is incredibly difficult because it's expensive. Getting legal aid is very hard. If I'm being really honest, if you've got mould and your landlord doesn't do anything about it, you're in a pretty tough position, I'd say. Sorry.
OK, tricky. Final question. Rory in London asks, how worried should tenants be about cyber attacks on councils that stop us from accessing council services? Yeah,
it's a really. I think the reason this question is being asked is because Cladding, who we've done a lot on this programme, biggest housing association in Europe, recently had a big cyber attack. A couple of other councils have as well. A lot of councils and housing associations moved to working at home during the pandemic, and they've become more susceptible to these kind of attacks. There's millions of social housing tenants, so there's a lot of data for these people to target. What I would say, so far, they haven't looked like they've got hold of lots of personal data. The big issue is more to do with the fact that when they are attacked by these cyber criminals, it becomes much harder for these housing associations to react. And therefore, if you're trying to get repairs done, trying to get payments changed, they're not responding. I've had lots of Clarion residents contact me saying, I just can't get repairs done at the moment because of this cyber attack that's taken place. So your data is probably less of an issue, but it's more of an issue trying to get a response from the landlord.
Yeah, well, Daniel, listen, so many questions. We could have answered so many more, couldn't we? But thank you very much.
No problem.